since 2001.
Yes.
Yeah. And her primary and her primary areas of teaching there are administrative process, food, and agricultural law, and that's where she has researched and published extensively as well. And also her visit here is because of the MOU that JTLS has recently signed with the School of Law at the University of New Hampshire, where we have collaborated on faculty exchange and other academic fronts, which she'll be discussing towards the later half of her talk. So our first part of her talk will focus on sustainable food systems and intellectual property rights compatibility. So over to you, Margaret.
Great. Thank you so much for the introduction. I am so pleased to be here. This is my thing at the University of New Hampshire Franklin Pierce Center for IP. So I hope we'll also have time maybe for questions. If not, you're always free to email me and continue the conversation afterwards. So I always like to begin my talk with one of the most basic questions we can ask. How many of you have eaten today? Show of hands. Right, we all eat, and so it's of interest to all of us. And what I hope to do is really help you think about the relationship between what you eat and IPRs and the future of the global population today. All very big issues, but I hope you'll find them interesting to think through. So the issue, food security is critical to the future. We know that globally. But we also know that food security can be challenged by climate change and that population growth really require innovation and technology. And I'll talk a little bit more in detail about why that is. Food systems are governed by really complex laws and policies. And think about your studies so far. Food systems can touch on everything from land ownership all the way through to the commercialization of a patented product in the agricultural sector. So huge. And if you're a systems thinker, you might be intrigued to be thinking about how all of those things work together. That's a lot of what my work does. So really, we're thinking about creating sustainable food systems. And I'll tell you what the components of sustainable food systems are in just a moment. But really, what we try to do when we think about sustainable food systems is reconciling all of those complex laws and those competing interests, whether they be against plant breeders and farmers and processors and distributors, and of course, all of us, the consumers. So I hope you'll understand a little bit more about sustainable food systems today. I know you've all studied IPRs, so that should be familiar to you. And then also understand a little bit about how they work together and where they come into conflict. I'll start with the biggest frame here, which is I look first always at public international law to think about what does the globe generally agree on before I begin narrowing it down into national or even local law. So I want to make you familiar, if you're not already, with the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, their definition of food security. So when you hear food security coming from the Indian government, the US government, this is what we are referring to. And I've highlighted those things that are the most important components. So we strive for food security for all people. And what that means is that you have physical, social, and economic access to food in the first instance. So physical, of course, is that you can access food. It's there for you. You don't have to travel a far distance. Social and economic access really speaks to, for example, who is able to go out and get your food. Who's responsible for that in the family? And of course, the economic access, can you afford food? It also needs to be sufficient, safe, and nutritious. Those are all global challenges. Finally, we also think about meeting dietary needs. And we say dietary needs and preferences and food preferences as a way to reflect and acknowledge that food is culture, and that people's food preferences may reflect their religion, they may reflect their family, or just generally where they come from in the globe. So that's also called culturally appropriate food. And this food security definition aims to make sure that people have access to that. And all of this, I hope, is for what you enjoy, which is an active and healthy life. And our goal really is, in this area of work, to think about the global population being able to achieve that, active and healthy. But there are great challenges to food security. You may know the current world population is about 7 billion people, and 800 million of them are undernourished. That is actually a much lower number than even 20 years ago. There has been great progress made globally in reducing the number of people who are malnourished. That doesn't mean that they don't exist. They're 800 million, still a very significant number. What may be more interesting to you is that for one of the first times in human history, the number of people who are overnourished, whether that be overweight or obese, which are two different definitions, but generally meaning you are over healthy weight, exceeds the number of undernourished people, which reflects some sort of imbalance in the food system. And what, again, sustainable food systems strive for is to regain some balance. We will never probably eliminate undernourished or overnourished populations, but we seek to reduce both to achieve a more healthy population. So by 2060, our world population is expected to accelerate to between 9 and 10 billion people. That poses profound challenges to food production, and in fact some experts have estimated that we will need a 60% increase in agricultural production globally. Now think about that, put that in the context of the Green Revolution, which has already increased yields as much as 50% around the globe since the 70s. I want to just caution you, and this is part of thinking broadly, these are numbers that I think we could debate. And I think you could also hear from some people globally who say, well, let's reduce food waste. If we reduce food waste, then we don't need this kind of increase in agricultural production. Where I come to settle on is, even if it isn't 60%, we do need to figure out how to produce enough food to feed that kind of population, 10 billion people. And that is challenged by two significant components globally. First is climate change, which poses particular threats because of drought and temperature to crops, current crops, and the other is the limitation on land. Much of our arable land is already in agricultural production. We know that clearing land, whether it be rainforest or other areas, has negative impacts on climate and carbon cycling, so that's not necessarily a good option. So we have to look at the land we have, and we have to look at taking care of it and making it sustainable so that it can produce what we need. So those are some of the challenges that we face. Just again, a quick show of hands. How many of you have heard of sustainable food systems or studied them at all? A few, not many. So let me just give you some an overview, and then I'll give you some examples of how you see sustainability being incorporated into the food system in a variety of ways. So we begin with it being viable, there being a viable food economy for farmers and producers. Without farmers able to make a living on the farm, they will not want to stay there. They will want to seek other economic opportunities. So we have to think about making it viable for our farmers to produce food. And the same thing for those people who may add value to food. They need to be able to make a living. It needs to be accessible and affordable for consumers. We can't produce food that people can't afford to buy. That won't work well either. Again, a sustainable food system is producing nutritious and healthy food. This is largely a scientific question globally. What is nutritious for you? What is healthy for you? I'm sure you probably hear lots of competing advice about what that might mean. I know I do in the US. One week, butter's okay. The next week, maybe not so much. The other really important component here is sound environmental stewardship. As I said, land is limited. And so making sure that we are stewarding that land in an environmentally friendly way is very important. As I said before, cultural heritage and customs also important. And in sustainable food systems, it's suggested that those aspects evolve within communities, and that there's great respect for, again, farmers and their knowledge, or the people who are preparing food and their knowledge, and that is part of what sustains a food system. Another important component is the effective use of technology. We have seen examples of effective use of technology. We've also seen examples of ineffective use of technology, and I'll talk about that in terms of genetically modified crops in just a moment. I also want to point out that sustainability is distinct from organic. Organic is a particular kind of agricultural production, and sometimes people confuse the two. Sustainable food systems, though, do understand and allow use of, for example, chemical inputs, but typically in a way that is thought through for environmental stewardship, as well as the economic impact of those kinds of inputs on farmers, and of course the health outcomes for consumers. So again, returning to that biggest level, FAO has defined sustainable agriculture. And sustainable agriculture looks at management, conservation of the natural resource base, and let us not forget that also includes water, and the importance, obviously, of water to life. Orienting technological change to ensure that we can continue to satisfy our human needs, not only now, but in the future. We often think about the here and now, and one of the challenges we have really is to think about what the future brings and how we adopt technology to ensure that the future is secured for our next generations. In the United States, in 1990, our laws actually began to define sustainable agriculture more narrowly and more specifically than the FAO definition. That was done in what we call the Farm Bill, because the Farm Bill is where our government has large crop subsidies and corporate farms are often seen to benefit. Our U.S. Department of Agriculture chose to define sustainable agriculture as a way to make sure that that kind of farming was preserved in our economy. And again, so much of this is about balancing things. Undernourishment, overnourishment needs to find a better balance. Corporate farming, small landholder farming needs to find a better balance. In the U.S., what we suggested was, and our law requires, is that if you are engaged in sustainable agriculture, you are working to sustain our food and fiber needs, you're looking at environmental quality, you make the most efficient use of non-renewable resources, and you also are able to integrate natural and biological types of agriculture. Again, a focus on economic viability of the farm. In the U.S., we have the smallest number of small farms that we've had in our history at this point. Farming is not economically viable for many families that it used to be economically viable for, and they have been selling their land to larger corporate farms, which is of concern to many, because again, a good sustainable food system will reflect a number of different business models for food production. And again, the law seeks to enhance the quality of life for farmers and society as a whole. In a very pragmatic level, the reason we defined this in our federal law is so that we could fund grant programs and provide economic incentive for those small farmers to stay on the farm and to show the federal government they do 1 through 5 there, and if they do, they may be eligible for specific kinds of funding and training. In India, your national mission for sustainable agriculture really defines sustainable agriculture in a very similar manner to the FAO. The other thing that you do in India, which I think is very important to sustainable food systems, is you've begun to look at how to integrate that definition of sustainable agriculture with the need to address climate change. And you have embraced thinking about how to use or how to adapt your farming systems to mitigate the effects of climate change. And in your national action plan, you actually acknowledge 3 really important elements to both sustainable agriculture and to the management of climate change, which is thinking about risk management, access to information, which we'll talk about in just a moment, And then the use of biotechnology. So it's interesting that you have embraced in your national policies the use of biotech in the farming system. So again, before we move on to IPRs, remember a sustainable food system is one that seeks to provide food security. It's balanced culturally, environmentally, and economically based on sustainable agriculture, able to address both population growth and climate change, and able to embrace technology. And when I talk about technology, I don't just mean crops. I may mean computer technology, for example. Does a farmer have access to national databases or global databases on climate? Can they harness the power of those databases to predict and monitor their water use and predict yields so that they are consistently using information and data to manage their methods? That's one thing that the globe is looking at and adopting. But as we do that, we have to think about the reality of that. Is a farmer in a developing country really standing by the side of her field or his field with a smartphone that is able to access the technology and use it? So a fundamental component of technology is really thinking about how is it going to be used within the particular kind of farming that it's being designed for. And so I hope that for IP lawyers, it's exciting to think about not just the cool things you can do with technology, but how you can involve people that it's designed for from the very beginning of the process to make sure it really achieves its promise. So let's talk for a moment about IPRs in agriculture. I'm sure you know patents pretty well. In the US, we have both utility patents for specific gene sequences, so those are genetically modified foods. We also offer plant patents through two specific laws, the Plant Variety Protection Act and the Plant Patent Act. So we have actually had IPRs affecting plants, I think since 1920 or 30. So it's not new, but genetically modified foods made it seem new. And I'll talk about the kind of the fundamental philosophical question that goes along with that in a minute. Now, trademark in the US, we don't have geographical indicators, we just have trademark, but globally we have GIs, and you have a very valuable one, or here in India that's known globally, basmati. And we, in the US, created some issues around basmati when we issued not only patents but also trademarks on the name and spawned some litigation that I'll talk about, which is a transactional cost of IPRs in the food system too, that one must consider when they're thinking about commercialization. And then interesting, copyright also plays a role here in that as developers of seed tried to react to the exclusion based on patents, they came across software and they came across open source thinking about, okay, how do we at least keep our lines open and maybe exclude corporations from them? Well, we'll use open source theory and copyright. So one of the things I love about food law is that it has it all in terms of IPRs, and it's a great puzzle to figure out if you're thinking about how to commercialize a product in the variety of ways that IPRs might affect you. So there are many issues, though, that come up as IPRs are integrated with sustainable food system thought. And the first one, and the one that I think I hear about most frequently from consumers, is concerns about utility patents for living things. And in the United States, the case of Diamond v. Chakrabarty really settled that if it met the utility patent elements, then it was patentable, regardless of whether or not the product being patented was living. I think that still causes people great concern. And we will continue to see litigation that tests the limits of what that actually means. But as farmers encountered it, it seemed very, what we say, I think in the United States, is upside down. For them, no corporation, no individual should be able to own a particular piece of life. And so for many farmers, that's a troubling notion. Cultural heritage and knowledge is of great concern in IPRs. Whether it's protected is the fundamental question, and the thing that we try to avoid, but we've not always been successful globally, is taking of either plant genetic resources that are known in indigenous cultures or particular methods and customs, having those kinds of things removed from the communities that develop them and commercialized for very low cost, because there's a low understanding within those communities potentially of what IPRs even are and the value that people may actually be possessing. And that's a question of how do we educate the world, particularly isolated societies, about the value of their knowledge and how it intersects with IPRs, a huge challenge. The agriculture and food economy, incredibly impacted by IPRs. And for those of you who are fascinated by economics, there's a lot here. There's a lot here to think about how once you commercialize a particular kind of, let's say, genetically modified seed, the effect not only of the cost to farmers, but the cost in the marketplace. You can do the same thing with organics, though, too. And you can say, why is that organic milk 3 times as much as the conventional milk? And think that through. So we always want to think about how IPR affects food affordability and also affordability of inputs for farmers. If it's not affordable, it's not worth it, is one way to think about it. Or you have to think about how to make it affordable. One of the most important issues that I think you'll hear, particularly around genetically modified foods, is about their safety. And what I first want to point out to you is that's post-IPR grant, typically. So you've already been patented, you've developed it and commercialized it, and now you're trying to get it onto the market. And generally consumers are really pushing back against the safety of those products. You have that issue in India. We'll talk about GM mustard in just a minute. We'll talk about eggplant. You know Europe is not interested in genetically modified foods. And you also know that the US, 80% of our soy, our soy and corn crops are actually genetically modified, and very similar in South America, especially Brazil. So that feeds into this challenge of the different regulatory approaches we have globally. In US, we have the coordinated framework, which is really a risk management framework. Our government says, we know you don't have all the safety answers. What we will do is we will assess how risky your product is. If the risk is not that high, you'll be approved for market. As you know, the precautionary principle counsels against that approach and works against it. The question that I would pose to all of you is, what are we trying to figure out when we think about safety? We have both the near-term safety, both to the environment and the soil and how farmers are producing things. We also have human health questions. Both have an immediate, if I eat something, does it make me sick? But they also have a long-term. What happens in terms of public health outcomes when we introduce a new food product? We may not know what it means in 40 years. Does it cause dementia? Does it cause diabetes? I would suggest to you, science can't answer those questions now. And so there's always some element of risk to using technology. And how you tolerate that risk is really a policy and ultimately a legal question. How do you design your laws to mitigate the risk, tolerate the risk, and then ultimately possibly compensate for harm from the risk if something should happen? Let's talk for a moment about GM eggplant, which is one of the first products introduced in this area. And introduced, I mean attempted in India, but it was marketed in Bangladesh, which informed, I think, much of your experience and reaction here. So if you don't know BT technology, this is the kind of genetic modification that inserts a gene into the plant sequence that makes it repellent to pests. So it will kill pests that eat it. It disrupts their digestive system and they die. In the US, we actually regulate BT crops as a pesticide. which a lot of consumer groups say, seriously, so we're eating pesticide, and it's a kind of a fun legal answer that yes, that's how we regulate it, and it is a pesticide. It's different than genetic modification to tolerate glyphosate and certain kinds of herbicides and pesticides. So BT technology was largely introduced in Bangladesh and considered a failure there for a couple of reasons. The yield increases were ultimately disappointing, and that's important because farmers bought into the technology on the hope of increased yields. They had higher input costs, particularly for seed, and that was sold to them as, well, don't worry about it because you're going to make more money when you grow more eggplant, and that was not necessarily the result there. As the developers attempted to bring the product here to India, it was a surprise, as I understand it, to many, but to environmentalists and farmers in particular, who became more activist. There was call for better understanding of pollen drift, and what that means is if you don't want GM crops on your fields and somebody next door is actually growing them, how do you avoid them? And if you do get them in your fields and you don't want them there, who's responsible for getting rid of them? Again, calls for better safety studies. Does this technology harm the fertility of the soil? Does it disrupt the balance of pests in the environment in a way that actually may promote some kinds of pests over others? And then also calls for labeling, that there should be consumer awareness if there were GM products being sold in the market, so that if consumers didn't want them, they didn't have to buy them. All of those things led to the GM eggplant not being commercialized here in India. But what you do know is that BT cotton was commercialized here successfully, very successfully. And 80% of your crop today is BT technology, and with about 5 million growers, and you are the second largest cotton producer on earth. So congratulations, and also, frankly, a success story of technology in many ways. So I'll ask you to question whether, if you're not interested in eating BT eggplant, why is BT cotton okay for you? And it would tend to indicate to me you're more concerned about human health and the health to yourself and your family than you are about possibly environmental health and the economics of it on the farm, which is fine, but it does speak to how if we have a system that just looks at a crop and not whether it's edible or non-edible with an IPR policy, we may need to be more refined in our thinking about that, and that's on a global scale. GM mustard continues to be in limbo in India. As you know, in October, your court ruled that even though it had been provisionally approved, there was a challenge to the science and the quality of the science. And so the approval for marketing was rescinded subject to a review of the safety study, which I understand at this point is ongoing but has not moved forward. So I'd be curious to know whether you think GM mustard crops should enter the market in India and whether you have confidence in the science or not. In the US, that's our number one consumer issue. Our consumers do not have confidence in the quality of the science that says genetically modified foods are safe both to the environment and to humans. And part of that problem comes from the fact that in the US, as here, the science is funded by the corporation developing the technology, and or they're funding scientists at university. So there's a conflict of interest around who's funding the science. And in the US, we have very limited public funding of this kind of science, which, as we were discussing earlier, why corporations have not decided to fund high quality science, I don't know. I wish they would, because if they really do have a product that will address food security and increase yields and viability for farmers, they're going to need to prove to consumers that it's safe. And if they can't do that, then we don't move forward, and that's not a sustainable product. So quickly, the basmati rice example, as I said, 16 years ago, the United States Patent and Trademark Office issued both some patents on some basmati rice to a company called Rice Tech. In the first instance, that patent was challenged and narrowed to a very specific line that was not traceable necessarily to genetic material from basmati, but was instead an enhancement made by Rice Tech. But what happened next was, now that it's patented, let's trademark it. Originally, there was a trademark for basmati rice issued by the USPTO, and that was challenged by rice growers and the geographical indication because there was a deceptively similar mark out there. And ultimately, basmati prevails and has a very strong GI. Internationally, the trademark issue really resolved in the favor of GI, and now when I see this company's product on U.S. shelves, it's marketed as Texmati rice because it's from Texas. Again, what I point out here is the transactional cost. It's been 16 years that this has been involved in U.S. IP litigation, and 7 years of litigation also in and around the trademark, and then also within India trying to identify the particular geographical area in which the GI can be claimed. Now, GIs are a great thing for farmers because you can command a higher price. But again, you have to think about if you're developing that kind of mark with a group of farmers, what are the transactional costs going to be? And if you're going to spend 16 years in litigation, who's paying for it? And how is that money kind of recouped over time? And so good questions to think about in terms of product development and soft IP in particular. My final piece of IPR is really the open source seed initiative. And I've quoted the initiative's goals here. They are concerned about seed company consolidation, so moving towards tight control by a few corporations of seed stock globally. The concern that patents and licenses can really restrict access to genetic material that farmers used to have access to. And so because seed saving is not permitted with patented material, and research material often has to be licensed and can be cost prohibitive, Open Source Seed Initiative seeks to foil that with copyright law and allow farmers to agree that if they use open source seed, that whatever improvements they make are available to the next user. And that also allows them to exclude companies like Bayer from that seed stock unless they agree to that condition, which I'm guessing they won't. Just a guess. So again, in the copyright example, you have to really think about how we're trying to use IPR to allow innovation and entrepreneurship from farmers. And we want to make sure that the IPR system does not exclude those who frankly have some of the best knowledge about how crops will react in the natural environment from the farming economy. And unfortunately, we can see with utility patents that actually has been a real result in some instances. And so the question is, if you think that copyright and open source seed is kind of an odd workaround for the patent system, it says then, should we have some customization of patent policy around plants beyond PVPA or PPA and things like that? And then also, how do farmers or breeders actually benefit from open source? I mean, it doesn't allow them to harness the full value of possibly their own intellectual capital. And isn't that what IPRs are supposed to do? So we do have an odd kind of back and forth between patent and copyright now. It's meant to address a problem in the system, but I would suggest to you, particularly if you're interested in IPR, really thinking through how to refine policy, particularly as it relates to foods, is a really great challenge because, it's requiring you to try to integrate some very different small economy, big economy, individual farmer versus big corporation. How does the system address them all, and can it? Those are the questions that are the future questions in this particular area. So sustainable food systems really are required if we are going to be able to feed ourselves and our global population. Innovation is an essential part of that, particularly in light of climate change. And IPRs, we know, are one of the most important components of innovation. And so incentivizing new plants that can survive and thrive in our new global climate is really, really important, as are higher yield varieties. So again, I leave you with a question of whether IPR policy today, whether that be reflected through an organization like WIPO or your own laws here in India, mine in the US, in the EU, are they addressing the unique issues that are required to think about a sustainable food system, both now and in the future, and one that's balanced? So I don't think we have time for discussion today, because I think I want to talk about just the programs if I have time.
We can spend 5 minutes.
5 minutes would be great. So here's some questions for you, but these you can think about. I'd love to know if you have questions or things that I've made you maybe think about or wonder about as I've gone through my talk.
Okay, so any questions, anybody? Keep it brief, introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi.
Hi, my name is Asmita. I was just wondering that if we were to grant property rights in seeds and new innovations in food security, it would eventually make it more expensive for farmers in countries like India, etc., to make that produce profitable. So the entire controversy of the increasing cotton prices in India because of Monsanto's claims over the BT cotton, that entire controversy. So how do we reconcile this?
I wish I had an answer to how to reconcile that. I would probably be in a different office than I am right now if I did. But one of the things I have to just say as an observation is one of the things that the Indian government did that was fascinating to me from around the globe was that when your government limited the royalties that a company could make on BT cotton, I think it shocked those companies. I'm not sure that they saw that economic solution coming. And the question for you in the future as you reason through that is, what is the right balance of government control of the amount of money that can be made once it grants the monopoly, right? Because that's what it's doing. It's giving away competition to a company in exchange for its IP. I think we all agree that that's a system that's worked, but maybe too well for the companies. So how does the government come back in and balance the innovation kind of ecosystem so that there's enough incentive for a corporation to develop helpful technology, but in a way that doesn't make farming and food production economically unviable for the farmer? That's the real question. I think you'd find globally multinational corporations are quite frightened to think that patents may be coming with greater limitations and that royalties may be limited if it means that farmers cannot produce. And similarly, I would say that governments may also begin to think about if a crop is envisioned to be a major, a large-scale farming monocrop environment where we harm genetic diversity, whether there will be less of a preference for that kind of patent over one that may, again, be purely about increased yields for a farmer who's growing a variety of crops. So it may be looking at the purpose of that commercialized product. Now, whether that's a question for the patent process or whether that's a question for, let's say, an agricultural ministry is another question. So one of the fun areas about this, or fun things about this area of law is you could probably think about it all day long and then for the weekend too. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Arjun. I'm a final year student. I'm really interested in the final question that you've raised in terms of sustainable food production. Where do you stand and what's your opinion on water? Because personally, I feel more than patenting debate and everything, I think fresh water, be it for drinking or cultivation, is going to be a bigger issue and an issue we'll have to deal with sooner than crop diversity or genetic diversity.
I think you're absolutely right. Two answers. You heard me say that let us not forget that water is really a fundamental component, if not the fundamental component of life. And so access to water is a threshold issue. It's one that comes before whether you can even grow anything. So if we think about it in farming, when we think about, again, if we think about patent priority, and what technologies we want to incentivize. First, we want to incentivize crops that may require less water as inputs. There's also the question of clean drinking water and the health of water if the products that we're patenting are being developed to increase tolerance to pesticides, and we're increasing our pesticide inputs, and that is resulting in polluted water, then that's not a patent we probably want to incentivize. So I think that first I would say water is essential. You're right to be thinking about that. And second, how we achieve a sustainable food system that ensures clean water for drinking and accessible water for irrigation is really a global problem, as you may know. In the US, due to our drought, there's increased riparian right litigation, and I think that you will see the law having to adapt to more water limitations, especially for agriculture, which requires us to, again, create plants that can grow with less water input. So great question.
Any more reflections? Anybody?
Okay. Yeah, I can talk about the programs. Can you bring up my second slideshow? Oh.
Given the limited time, we'll quickly switch over to the second topic for today, which is the graduate programs that are offered by the University of New Hampshire School of Law. And I think once Margaret is done explaining, if you have any specific questions about those programs or probably about the collaboration that JGLS has with the University of New Hampshire, please feel free to ask.
So I will go through this quickly, but I do want to invite you all to think about study at the University of New Hampshire. We're very pleased to be a partner of your law school, and some of your faculty are our graduates, which we very much appreciate. We are a top 100 law school, our general program, under the U.S. News rankings. And that's very important. We're also equally proud of our very prominent position in intellectual property. We're ranked number 5 in the US for IP. And we have actually the distinction of being the only law school that has been included in that ranking in the top 10 since the rankings were begun. So we are a perennial ranked IP program. We're also a very welcoming small community. It's diverse. We have a lot of course, people in New Hampshire in our community, but we're also as open as we resettle refugees as part of the UN program in New Hampshire. So you find an interesting mix of people in our community. The most important thing you should know as learners and students is that because we're a small community, you know your faculty. If you were my student, I would be very interested in why you came, for example, to the US. What are your career goals? What are you thinking of doing? What interests you intellectually? And our students, what we tell our students even in the US as they apply, if you want to hide in the back of the room, we are not a school for you. If you want to, and hey, we've all been that student. It doesn't mean in every class, but it means that we want you to be comfortable being known and being somebody who can influence your community, contribute, and be engaged. We're also we're a very safe campus. We're, compared to the population sizes that you have here in your Indian cities, we're very tiny, very, very tiny. You'd probably get to know all 43,000 people by the time you were done in a year or 2 years. We're a walkable city, very accessible to the seacoast, to the mountains, to Boston, and we're five hours from New York City. So we have a great location in northern New England. Our programs are threefold. We offer residential, limited residential, and online for our master's and LLM programs, and master's in intellectual property. If you're full-time, you complete an LLM in 1 year. Part-time students, meaning you've chosen limited residential or online, you can finish in 5 years. So what we offer, intellectual property is our most popular. Commerce and technology is an outgrowth of IP for us. It focuses more on antitrust and business management. And then we have an online international criminal law and justice program. The advanced standing JD may be of interest to you. The American Bar Association in the last few years has allowed U.S. law schools to offer LLB holders from international law schools to earn their Juris Doctor degree in 2 years. As I was talking with your faculty earlier, I want you to know the reason that I support this. I absolutely understand it's a more expensive option, but at our school what it allows you to do is both study core American law as well as become expert in intellectual property. What the JD allows you to do in the US, though, is not just sit for the New York bar, but to sit for any bar. So if you earn a JD from an accredited law school, you can sit for the bar in any state in the US. And it's an increasingly popular option. So for our application, it's very straightforward. We have no fee because we are a partner of this law school. We require 2 letters of recommendation. For our LLM program, we often see work experience before you're coming on to your LLM, and so we typically see an employer or a professor. For those of you who might pursue a JD right after an LLB, it's typically 2 professors. We look for your CV and your personal statement about why you want to study at our particular school. These are 2 lovely ladies who staff our admissions team, and if you hear of our reputation as Franklin Pierce or UNH, again, you'll know we're a very small community, and these 2 become kind of your best friends. They're your chat buddies. They try to make transition into the U.S. very, very easy for you and answer any questions that you have about study with us along the way. We're very proud to have many alumni around the world, but and particularly here in India, Mahua Roy Chowdhury is a wonderful friend of mine, Mumbai, who is a trademark and copyright lawyer, who has she's remained connected with the school. She visits us. She has a really fascinating career. And one of the other things that we try to do is connect you. As I said, I would ask you as a faculty member, what's your career interest? What do you want to do? Where do you see yourself going? And because we're a small community, what we try to see is, okay, who have we graduated? Who's doing what you want to do? Can you have a conversation with them? Will they talk with you and help you build your professional network while you're studying with us, so that when you graduate, you have a lot of people in your professional network who can help you achieve your goals and also give you perspective on your goals? Because we all know sometimes what you think you want to do, I think for all of us, isn't necessarily what we end up doing. But you always end up in a good place. So I know that you're very busy, and I don't want to give you more detail than you need. But I would highly encourage you to think about studying with us if you're interested in particular in intellectual property, be that an LLM or the Advanced Standing JD program. And I'm happy to answer any questions, as are my colleagues Pam and Marie via email, and I'll make sure that your international office has all the information that you need. I'd really like to thank you for listening today, and I'm happy to answer questions. So thank you very much.
Any questions?
Yes.
What's the experience between their first degrees and the...
Great question. In the U.S., there's no age limit, and we certainly do accept people who have a few years of experience between their LLB and entering the JD program. That's totally fine. Again, we're just looking for recommendations typically from your employer that the JD makes sense for you, that your career goals are consistent with it. Yes?
If I pursue an LLM in IP, then would I be allowed to take non-IP subjects? I mean, how many subjects would I be allowed to take?
You are really only allowed, if you do the LLM in intellectual property, to take 2 electives outside of the IP curriculum. And our students usually take a subject that might be aligned, like business associations or contracts, for example, U.S. contracts. We try to discourage that because we want to give you an LLM and IP, and we know you're only with us for a year. We want you to get a really strong core in patent, trademark, copyright, and then move on to advanced subjects. So we do limit it outside. When students say to me, I would like to take a broader number of classes, then I say, I think you should consider the Advanced Standing JD, because then the full curriculum, of course, is open to you.
is the class size of your LLM program?
Our LLM program varies. Each cohort that we enter is between 15 and 25. It's an international group. India, China, Korea, and Taiwan are our top sending countries, but we also have a few students in each class from either Eastern Europe, typically Ukraine or Russia, as well as Western Europe and Africa. Yes, sir.
We have another tie-up with Indiana University.
Mm-hmm.
They already say 1 year of LLB and 1 year of JD in US.
Mm-hmm.
So is it 3+3 in case of University of New Hampshire?
We are, if you have an LLB, it would be your LLB +2. We have 2 years in the JD program. And if you have an LLB and you just want the LLM, it is your LLB study here +1.
Thank you.
One more. Are there any scholarships available for international students who want to pursue their LLM or GED in university?
Yes, because this school is a partner school with us, our memorandum of understanding includes for all students coming from this school a reduction in our tuition of 35%. We have limited scholarships after that, but that's how we try to address affordability of the program.
I have a question in the bar exam, which I think they should be asking, but
Yep.
probably they still don't know if they go for masters.
Yes.
Whatever. So if you do LLM in intellectual property, are
Yep.
you eligible to sit for the bar, for the New Hampshire bar, or for the New York or SF?
Yep. It's a great question. If you have an LLB and you earn an LLM, you are eligible to take the New York bar exam. As I was explaining to some of your faculty members earlier, one of the advantages to studying in New Hampshire is that in the US now there's something called the Uniform Bar Exam. If you're at all interested in studying in the US, I want you to look up the UBE and understand what it is. What it means is you take the same exam, which is called Uniform Bar Exam, and your score goes to New York. So what you can do is you can come to a state like New Hampshire, you study for a year, you prepare for the bar, you sit for the bar in New Hampshire, so you don't have to do the travel to New York, you don't have to figure that out, you can just stay where you're comfortable and prepare for the UBE there. You sit in New Hampshire, and then you wait for your results, which we hope are good.
Any other question?
Good afternoon, I'm Sean. I'd like to know what are the job prospects after pursuing the LLM program, considering it's one of the best with regards to IP. But if we look at the US rankings, I'm not sure where it exactly stands in the general law submissions. Yep. So what do you feel would be the job prospects after that?
Yeah. So we are a top 100 law school, which means that our job prospects are good. But I'd like to particularly address international lawyers, because that is more of a challenge in the U.S. economy. I'm sure you've all been reading about the Trump administration. I want to assure you that you're very welcome as students. For some time now, though, in the U.S. economy, it has been somewhat harder for international lawyers to gain full-time employment. And we always caution our international students that if your career goal is to work for a U.S. law firm, we certainly can't guarantee that. We can try to promote it when you're with us. If you're in the advanced standing JD program, all of our students do legal residencies, so they are placed in law firms and they earn credit while they're studying in the law firms. Whether or not that law firm offers you a job is completely up to them. I think the OPT is offered to our graduate students, and then the H-1B visa is really exclusively between an employer and the employee, so the law schools have no influence over that. But I would tell you that that's of concern for law firms in the U.S. is just whether they can attain an H-1B for their international employees. We do have a good relationship with many multinational law firms, those that have offices around the globe. And sometimes what happens is you have a legal residency with a firm's office in Boston. You may get an offer from them. It may be to work in Singapore. So there are options. I would say it's not an easy path. But again, if it's one that we know you're interested in coming in, we will do our best to counsel you and help you achieve that goal.
Thank you so much, Margaret, for visiting us, for taking the questions.
Thank you all. You're a lovely
Explaining
group.
in